Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy for Zimperium. I'd like to welcome you to another webinar. These webinars are all part of a series that we decided to do that started with our Global Threat Report, which we put out for the first half of the year we did a webinar on it on July 31st. And so the State of Enterprise Mobile Security for the first half of the year report came out. You can download it from the site. You can check out that webinar if you'd like. And we had a lot of folks that are relatively new to mobile security. They might be folks that know mobile but aren't familiar with security, or folks that know endpoint security but aren't familiar with mobile, that basically asked us, hey, can you actually now take the four major buckets of attack vectors and go to another level and actually kind of explain what is a MIDM, what is a rogue access point, what is a device compromise, what is a malicious profile, etc. So we're running through the four of them. 2 weeks ago we did device compromises. Last week we did phishing. This week we're doing network, and then next week we're going to come back and do malicious apps. Quick other side note: you may have seen some of the information on the iOS exploits that Google Project Zero told about, some malicious websites that have been delivering exploits to iOS devices for, they say, a couple of years. We're doing a webinar on that specifically tomorrow. So that will cover most of these as well. So if you want another kind of level of information, we'll dive into that. So good news for you guys. One of the best parts about diving into these four is you don't just have to listen to me. We have incredibly talented technical sales engineers on our staff, and we're joined by one of them today. We're joined by Steve Flowers. Steve is our systems engineer that covers the central part of the United States. He's going to help me with some additional details. So, Steve, thanks for joining me, brother.
Hey, thanks, JC. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Cool. I'm definitely excited to have you here as well. All right, so let's dive in. By the way, standard stuff. Please make sure and follow us on social media so you can find out about threats as they're coming out and other pieces of information: LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, your choice, Twitter, obviously. So please follow us on that. We're going to try and keep this to about 20, 25 minutes of content, then Q&A. If there is no Q&A, we don't create it. We don't believe in that. And we will actually give you time back to go grab a hamburger or, breakfast, where it depends on what part of the world you're in. So with that, let us dive in. First thing that a lot of people need to understand is this, and everybody is now catching on to this: mobile is just another endpoint. If you have patient data sitting on a tablet, it's no different than if you have patient data sitting on a laptop, for instance. So a couple of years ago, last year, was actually when there was a turning point. Before that, the mobile security solutions were being largely looked at by the mobility teams. Last year was the turning point where every project we're involved with now, endpoint security is involved, because mobile is just another endpoint. And so if you look at it, the traditional endpoint security covers 40% of the typical enterprise devices accessing the enterprise today. Mobile devices represent 60% of the attack surface now, and for multiple reasons are primary targets. One, the user is the admin. Two, spends the majority of his time outside of protected networks. Three, related to the user being the admin, they choose what other networks they're going to connect to, which is obviously the focal point of this conversation today, et cetera, et cetera. And another part is there's only a minimum of protection on these things. There's only a few, because of companies like ours that are coming along, the protection is relatively nascent. So there's a broad exposure. Bad guys have certain time-tested rules, one of which is land and expand. They like to find the weakest link in and then expand. Well, now those weakest links are these supercomputers that are in the hands of users who are our biggest threat always anyway, spending all this time outside our protected networks, prime target. So these endpoints are under attack. We like to level set this. 100% of our customers, we have thousands of customers around the world, tens of millions of endpoints, 100% detect attacks, which is where some of the data came for the threat report that I mentioned you can grab off the site or listen to the webinar. I like to kind of joke similar to the arrow in the FedEx logo. Once somebody shows it to you, it's almost impossible to unsee it. Now that we're talking about mobile attacks, every time you turn around, you're going to see something. Like I said, the iOS thing was out. Before that, there was Android malware that was draining batteries. Before that, it just comes boom, 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 and you're going to see it. Mr. Bezos, obviously became a poster child for it earlier in the year. It is important to note, though, that mobile attacks are different than traditional attacks. The end result is still the same. The end result is that I need to maintain persistence. The bad guys have an ROI. Once they take over a device, whether it's a server, a point of sale terminal, or a mobile device, they want to remain persistent for as long as humanly possible. Because iOS and Android mobile is architected differently, the only way to be persistent is to actually compromise the device. So if you look at the iOS exploits we're talking about tomorrow, the ultimate objective was to actually get a foothold that you could keep on that device. Think of the ROI calculation. They've made their investment. How do they maximize their return? By keeping it for as long as possible. Because all apps are in containers, which is what we're talking about next week, malicious apps by themselves are a means to an end. And they're basically, our job at Zimperium is to protect enterprises and government institutions. Our job is to protect against targeted attacks against named entities. If I'm going after XYZ company or XYZ agency, I'm not going to drop an app in the App Store and pray somebody downloads it from one of those agencies or one of those companies. It's not the way it's going to work. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use a network attack. The most efficient way to target these people in the beginning of almost every kill chain, including the iOS one for tomorrow we're talking about, and the topic of today, is a network attack. You set up a fake network across the street from XYZ, or you do a MIDM attack across the street from XYZ. You wait till somebody from XYZ connects to you, bang, you deliver the compromise. So the network attack represents 90% of the targeted attacks begin with a network attack. That's the focal point for today. Malicious apps, untargeted, designed for fraud, can deliver an exploit, not super efficient. Phishing, which we talked about last week, becoming a major vector because 90% of breaches start with a phishing attack and 2/3 of emails are read on mobile. And then there's a whole bunch of new attack vectors for phishing that we talked about last week. But the primary attack vector is the network. So we're going to dive in. And like I mentioned, this comes from the report. What we do is we break things into threats or risks and attacks. Okay? So threats or risks are things that inherently make you more exposed or make you more likely to have a successful attack occur. So we're going to do threats first, and then we're going to come over to the actual attacks themselves. So this is where the cool part is. You get to start hearing from Steve. So Steve, we're gonna dive in, and I'm going to hit the first two slides here. First thing is this: this again comes from 45 million endpoints that we looked at for the first half of the year, and we said, okay, we're going to look at the enterprise devices on here. A third of these mobile devices encountered networks that we consider risky. Okay, what do we mean by risky? Well, what they are is there's three big buckets, and the largest are unsecured Wi-Fi's. The next is a captive portal, and then there's rogue access points. So by their nature here, they're not necessarily exposing you from stealing data or anything, but they can be precursors to other things. So Steve, can you just kind of elaborate a little bit, like what exactly is an unsecured Wi-Fi? Why would it be a risk? Same thing with captive portal, and then of course rogue access points. Just maybe give some thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, JC. So an unsecured Wi-Fi, like you were saying, it's a threat. Doesn't necessarily mean it's bad or malicious, but there's that potential, right? So an unsecured Wi-Fi simply means that it doesn't really have a password, or there's no encryption or anything like that. It's wide open, right? A lot of places have that, and those kind of work in conjunction with like a captive portal, right? Where we would go to maybe a hotel or on for example, on the planes these days, they're prime examples of captive portals. Not necessarily a bad thing, but there's that potential for you don't know what else is happening on that network. And then the other risks, those could be the bad guys that are really just standing out there listening to what your phones are saying, broadcasting the networks that they all know about, seeing if they can connect to them.
Yeah, and actually, I realized I misspoke a little bit when I was talking about rogue access points. That we're going to get to that because that's an actual attack. I think other network risks, don't they also include, Steve, like reconnaissance scans and things like that are kind of polling and trying to get a feel for things?
Right. That's exactly one of the mechanisms that attackers would use to identify their targets. So let's say, for instance, a phone does connect to a captive portal or an unsecured Wi-Fi network. The attacker may be out there just scanning your phone to see what ports are open or to see if there's a certain vulnerability available. So once they find something, then they can actually leverage that with advanced mechanisms, and I'm sure we'll get into that here in a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thought on the captive portal side. Clearly, people probably have an understanding of unsecured Wi-Fi, and they're like, okay, obviously there's no password, probably no encryption, clearly potentially dangerous. I think the thing with captive portals, we get a lot of questions about it. And people are like, well, who cares? So it pops up a little thing and it says Starbucks, whatever. Again, as we're talking about tomorrow, at the risk of complete redundancy, the beginning of that kill chain, that iOS thing that Google Project Zero has come out and it's been all over the papers, it basically starts with you hit a website. In that case, you were lured to a website. It was able to start delivering an exploit. You look at phishing attacks. You're lured to a website. It can steal your credentials, but the other reason it's very risky is the minute your browser starts to process a page, an exploit can be delivered. Isn't that part of the concern of captive portals? That unless it happens to really be the captive portal of Starbucks, which is not going to be a problem, part of the risk is anytime a browser gets processed automatically, an exploit can be delivered. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct. Yeah, that's absolutely true. And the one thing that I wanted to mention earlier, but I forgot about it was, you can use tools or mechanisms such as like social engineering to, maybe it's like you're saying, maybe it's not the Starbucks that's a legitimate captive portal, but maybe it's something else that just looks like Starbucks, right? So really what we're talking about with a network threat is it's an easy way to start exploiting the user's trust.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as we talked about, you ask any security professional, what's the single biggest risk? They'll always tell you it's a carbon-based life form. It's the users, it's the human beings. And so now we just kind of exacerbate that because they're the admins of these devices. So those are the threats. Now we're going to pivot over to the attacks. First thing, almost 1 out of 10 of our enterprise mobile endpoints, and again, we're talking tens of millions of endpoints around the world, almost 1 in 10 experienced an actual network attack. Now, what do we mean by a network attack? Well, here we're going to talk at the highest level of what the big buckets are, and then we're going to dive into one specific type of man-in-the-middle attack, which was predominant in the first half of the year. So what you see here is the majority of the network attacks that we saw, 93% of the network attacks and 86% of all attacks. Remember I said 90% of the attacks begin with a network? There's your number right there, right? But 93% of the attacks and 86% were MIDMs. And the remainder to make the 90, or the rest you're looking at here. So Steve, can you run through just kind of an order, start with man in the middle, just kind of explain what it is, and kind of, also a question is physical proximity, these guys have to be, and then SSL, and then finally finish out with kind of rogue access points. Just kind of give a feel for kind of how does the attack occur and why is it a risk?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So a man in the middle attack simply, it's going to it's more like, think of it like a proxy, right? So if I'm an attacker, I'm going to stand up a man-in-the-middle attack, and I'm going to poison or take down the legitimate gateway for that network, and I'm going to tell the attacker, I'm going to tell the victim that I'm now the gateway. My command and control server is now the gateway and everything. So what can I do with a man-in-the-middle attack? Maybe it's just, you know, benign. Maybe it's something more intent, more purposeful, right? So what I can do is watch the traffic that's going by. And here I want to make a good point is we don't always need to exploit the device to exfiltrate usable data. So if I'm only watching this, and maybe I couple that with an SSL downgrade, so I trick the browser of the device to think that it's secure when it's really not, then I can start stripping off the SSL layers and start looking at login data. So maybe I get your Facebook account data, maybe I get your Salesforce login data, right? So it's just another way that data can be taken off of that device that doesn't necessarily have to be exploited. And that's how it starts, is with the man in the middle. So somebody's sitting there, they have to be close, right? They have to be on the same network. That's not something that's going to survive going through a router or anything like that, typically. So as we're talking about targeted attacks, that user has to be somewhere. So if we're going to a coffee shop, that attacker is probably sitting in there or close to it, right? Maybe they're across the street with a directional antenna sniffing the same network. Now, a rogue access point would be something more along the lines of, I've identified my target now, and I want to make something very specific, and I'm only attacking or targeting this one person. So what I would do is stand up, you know, maybe use a Wi-Fi pineapple, for example, right? Maybe stand up a rogue access point to listen to what that target is telling me that they're trying to connect to, and then spoof that same network and trick that device into connecting to my access point. And then, like I said earlier, you know, we're talking about social engineering comes into play. You know, maybe we can use something more advanced like cross-site scripting. There's any number of ways that we can redirect that traffic, because once you own the network, you own where that user can go. You can then start manipulating everywhere that you want them to be. And then, you know, maybe you trick them into giving up their credentials. Maybe you trick them into visiting one of the malicious websites that's going to compromise their device.
Exactly. And to your point, the physical proximity thing sounds like for lack of a better term, at first blush, you might go, it sounds like a deficiency. I mean, you know, it is a deficiency as an attacker if you're going after a broad consumer market for fraud, which is why you would use malicious apps for that, like BankBot, right? But if I'm going after a specific company, that is the most efficient way of being able to do it, right? So there's one particular variation of man-in-the-middle attacks that was the favorite. As you can see, almost half the total attacks was what is referred to as an ARP MIDM, an address resolution protocol MIDM. Can you just kind of explain, you know, conceptually how an ARP MIDM works?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you would do, and I alluded to this earlier and everything, is as an attacker, there's two pieces to it. So first, I'm going to take the original gateway. Maybe that's the original access point, router, whatever networking piece of equipment that's providing the access to the internet. I'm going to take that down by a various method, whether it's you know, a simple DOS attack, something just to keep it busy, and just like basically I'm going to tell it, hey, don't pay attention to any traffic that's coming to you. The second half of that is then going to be to broadcast to all of your targets your MAC address, the attacker's MAC address, or media access control address and everything. Basically, it's a layer 2 protocol and everything, where you're telling everybody else on that same segment of the network that you're now the gateway. So in that instance, as an attacker, I would be telling my victims that my command and control server then is the actual gateway to their internet. And then once that happens, maybe you just let them go to the internet, and you're only watching the traffic at that point.
Interesting, really interesting. So, briefly, because we're at 20 minutes after, just want to hit a couple other things. Um, Two other pieces of information that we thought was really interesting in the report. We're talking about targeted attacks, right? So we're talking about an adversary that is saying, I want to go after a certain company, agency, population, whatever the case may be. When you look at this, almost a third of the network attacks that we saw in the first half of the year, and again, tens of millions of endpoints, scattered throughout the industrialized world, almost a third were in the Republic of Korea, which I think is absolutely fascinating. We've got a thing called Danger Zone, which is a visual mapping of places where we detect threats like this, and it's lit up like a Christmas tree. Now, what I do think is also interesting is, and Japan was second place, by the way. So, you sit there and you go, okay, I wonder, what is actually driving some of it. Some of it clearly is geopolitical. There's no doubts about that. But what is interesting is that the top 10 cities, even though, of course, many from South Korea are represented in here, the top 10 cities only accounted for 15% of the attacks. So, meaning 85% of the attacks were scattered throughout the rest of the world. Some of the ones that I think were really interesting is, the top representatives in the United States were Oakland and Seattle. You kind of sit there and go, I wonder what's being targeted in those particular areas. I mean, Seattle could be tech, not quite sure. We know for a fact that we've seen rogue access points targeting our tech companies in the Valley. So pretty interesting stuff. So this is never intended to be a product pitch at all, but it is important to note one thing. And I'll briefly explain our product and then we'll go to Q&A. Clearly, you've gotten this message by now. And Steve said it just a minute ago. The bad guy owns the network 9 times out of 10. So we can put it in this little, the start of a targeted attack, or there's a network threat, or, what it comes down to is the bad guy owns the network. Steve was talking about he could redirect you different places, but he can also not redirect you certain places. If you have all of your detection in the cloud, you can't protect yourself. You can't. So even Gartner has caught on to the fact that you need to do all of your detection on device. Zimperium is the only major competitor that does 100% of the attack vectors. We do machine learning based detection on device. Now, we're not doing machine learning on device. We do machine learning up in the lab against billions of data points from those tens of millions of endpoints. Once we know what are the right things to describe the behavior that is indicative of these attacks, we actually deploy what we call Z9 onto devices. Z9 is our detection engine. Z9 can be rolled out in one of two ways. If you're trying to protect the device 100% of the time and all the data that's on device 100% of the time, you use a product called ZIPS, and that stands for Z Intrusion Prevention System. That is basically next generation antivirus, EPP, whatever you want to call it, for mobile. If, however, you have a mobile app and you want to deploy the protection, the ability to detect those attacks inside of the app, we have an SDK called ZApp for in-app protection, where you can drop the engine directly in. But in that case, you're not trying to protect the device. You're trying to protect the app and the session that app is having. So an easy example that everybody can understand, we have banking customers that are using ZIPS to protect their employees, and they're using ZApp to protect their mobile banking users. So that's an example. Both of those come into our console. Another huge benefit of doing all of our detection on device is we are completely cloud agnostic. We believe as an enterprise security company, we need to fit into your investment strategy, not force you to fit into ours. So whatever cloud you want to go for, go ahead. We're also the only one, you see the AWS GovCloud down there in the corner. We're the only mobile threat defense solution, that's Gartner's term, that is FedRAMP ATO, authority to operate. We're the only one. We also have behind it Z3A, stands for Advanced App Analysis. That is perfectly legitimate apps, but have security and privacy risks in them. That'll be part of the conversation next week. We integrate them with the largest number of UEMs. We're also the only ones that can handle multiple UEMs in a single console. And so if you're going from one to another, for instance, we can handle that without you having to delay your protection. And we put all the information inside of the SIM. So end of product pitch. I would like to thank Steve for doing this with me. I'm going to stop for a second, see if there's any questions. And if not, we'll give you guys the rest of your day back. And Steve, any other, kind of thoughts or something you were, thinking about where you're like, this is something I'd like to cover, or do you think we covered everything?
I think we did pretty good, I think. I don't have anything right offhand.
Okay, perfect. Well, I don't see any questions. So with that, I would like to thank everybody. Reminder again, if you're interested in the iOS exploit, we're doing another webinar tomorrow. Next week, we'll be on malicious apps and risky apps, as I was just talking about with Z3A. So everybody have yourself a great day. And Steve, thanks again for joining me.
Thanks, JT.